Hello, welcome to 20 years of domain-driven design. Driven domains, design-driven domains, domain-driven designs, and I did the thing again. I didn't loop, or I looped the loop incorrectly. Sorry about that. For those who were here early, waiting in the waiting room, in the pre-stream room, with the elevator music. I know you like the elevator music, so I'm very sorry about the mix-up. Saddam, hello. It's nice to have you again. So today, just gonna give a few minutes for everybody to catch up on the announcement that we started. In case anybody's watching the recording, hello. So today's agenda, shifting from the focus from clean architecture, because these are adjacent concepts. We did clean architecture, and then we'll go a little bit into event modeling, and now we're doing domain-driven design. They're all connected. Generally, with event modeling, you would generally try to understand and model the way the data flows within your domain, and then how it leaks out of your domain to infrastructure concerns. That's what event modeling allows you to do. Clean architecture allows you to shape the structure in which these dependencies happen. And domain-driven design, primarily, what it does is create a framework of communication that helps us have conversations about what the thing that our software is trying to solve is, but not from the solution perspective, but from the perspective of, if this was a sort of brick and mortar, pen and paper human process, what is that process that we're solving beyond the software? For example, the domain of Uber is getting people jobs, having a two-vector marketplace for riders and passengers, and essentially being a cheaper taxi. It's nothing to do with technology. The fact that the technology is there to enable all of that, that is a means to an end. If apps suddenly got banned, I'm sure Uber would still function through text messages, or just like a web-based little protocol, or whatever else would replace it. Let's not get too hooked up on the UI side of things. The domain is still getting people from A to B, being a cheap taxi, being very reliable, and maybe having options, leaving feedback, and giving people jobs in a way that is sort of self-accelerating and without having the Uber company needing to have leased vehicles. Same thing with Netflix, just delivering entertainment. They didn't start off as a streaming service. It was just about how can we get movies from A to B, and it doesn't even have to be a movie. It can be a show. It can be a series. It can be a masterclass, a documentary. All right, so it doesn't have to be directly from the quality side of IMDb. It can be anything. So do not get hooked up on that too much. I do have the chat open. If you have any questions regarding domain-driven design, I will jump into it. For your convenience, the agenda today is most focused on the anniversary side of DDD. So I did a survey just before we started the stream, the beginning of this week, checking the temperature of how people are using DDD, how where is the industry at right now, what do people think it is, isn't. There we'll be looking at an open source book that you can find on this link. I will open it up shortly in the browser so you can then check it out. And yeah, just waiting for your questions to come in if there's any. Let's look into it. Let me do the doodly-do. Let me open up the chat there so I don't miss anything. This is here. Okay. Question from me. Do you use domain-driven design? A lot of people who claim to use test-driven development don't actually practice it. And based on my survey that I did this week, a lot of people who claim to be doing domain-driven design don't practice it. Or at least don't practice it fully. So one of the things I want to share first, let's see. Share screen. Yes, share screen. This one. Sure. Yeah. And I want to go into this format. Yes, very nice. So I posted a survey on LinkedIn. Ooh, this doesn't scale well. I posted a survey on LinkedIn about how practitioners use domain-driven design. You know, is it just? Hang on, did I? I don't have the link for it here. Primarily, the question was related to the areas of the book, ranging from the popular side to the complex side. The book does have a little gamification aspect in the pattern side, which I really enjoy. You know, I think any books related to patterns. You know, Greg Young is writing a new book about patterns right now. Kent Beck released a new book regarding micro-refactorings and the economics of it, which, by the way, this article is about. This Crafting Tech Teams article that I wrote. They published, I believe, yesterday. So anytime there's a software-related book about patterns, rest assured that it's going to be popular. But the book isn't just about the patterns you'll find in DDD. The book is also about a much more overarching and important concept, like ubiquitous language, like doing event storming, like context, understanding the language that your stakeholders use, understanding the reasoning why the software is being developed, what are the underlying business concerns, domain concerns. Yeah, so I just checked out the fresh link. The votes didn't change much, so the percentages of the answers are still the same. So the question was, how widely do you apply DDD in your teams? A popular but not the majority answer was no domain-driven design. We have our own process or something else. The most common answer was the tactical aspect, the coding, the design patterns. So these are your entities, VOs, the value objects, the repositories, the aggregates. Although aggregates I very rarely see, which we'll also find in the book and the online book that we're about to review. And all that comes with it. The less common side of the patterns would be things like anti-corruption layers, more specific infrastructure concerns that are very specific to domain-driven design, things like a certain style of adapters or hexagonal architecture. What else is in the book? Let me just jog my memory real quick. Yeah, that's mostly it. Yeah, on the tactical side, there's also this idea of having a sort of functional paradigm to the domain layer, where this is also very much concurrent with the event modeling practices, especially with vertical slices that dictate the more important invariants. So there are rules in your system. Those rules should be side effect free, perhaps written in a functional style, in a very declarative or functional style, less so imperative, and the least desired property of, let's say, a very pure domain layer would be that it's procedural, that there is a sort of do this, do that, and there's a sort of flow to it, rather than being sort of a fixed set of rules and environments that you need to follow. So that's the tactical side. And the book also changes it from tactical to strategic. The strategic side is a little bit more interpersonal, so it has to do with conversations within your team. This is where the sort of non-technical, to me, this is where the real value comes in. To me, the strategic aspect talks about if I'm going to build this and there's some kind of aggregate factory machine abstract provider or service thingy, that's how I can call it to make the compiler happy. But what does the business call it? Is there a business concept for some of these more technical solutions? Is there, when you if you're in accounting and you file a new invoice, is there a concept for how the invoice ID is generated? Is there a certain sequence? Does it have to do with the year? And then we'll figure out that it actually has to do with the book. The sequence is in sequence within a certain book. And then there's a concept of books, which is accounting specific, not so much literature specific, right? So once we get those conversations going with the business side through conducting event storming or just having an interview with the domain subject matter expert in DDD style, we start extracting nouns, verbs, concepts, even the same words that have different meanings in different contexts. And that's the context mapping, where we say, I have this context here and that context over there. They share some responsibilities, but are fundamentally different. It's probably, this is where team topologies comes in. It's probably plausible to say that, hey, a different team should work on this thing compared to that thing. And then you might ask yourself what context mapping is. Well, context mapping is then determining, okay, does this team own the data set, or do they? Is this sort of like a cooperation? Is this sharing some information, or is this an upstream, downstream sort of master-slave sort of, or even conformist operation where this team just decide how things are going to be, and then this team will adapt to it, and then there's a certain delay, but like a backward compatibility or some guarantee of like how quickly or how slowly they can adapt. So that's more the context mapping. That deserves a conversation, an episode of its own. But it does have very sexy cheat sheets on what the different context mappings mean. But I do have to refresh my memory on all of the definitions. So I would rather do that on the next episode. If you find that interesting, just let me know in chat. So far, no major questions have arrived, or they have arrived without my knowledge. So I'm just going to refresh real quick to check in. Okay, we got no concrete questions so far. Okay. So continuing on this, and then there's the everything else, which is the domain-specific language, which is the ubiquitous language. You might be talking about some layered architecture. You might be talking about the idea that there is a concept of terms, a terminology, a vocabulary that the business is sharing, or perhaps several contexts in which the vocabulary is appropriate. And then what those mean and how they apply and when they don't apply. Some rules, let's say. And you'll often find that the rules of the vocabulary match the cadence at which the rules of the business change. So, for example, if you have a thing like I have a blockchain element that I call a ledger, and that has to do with Ethereum, and then there's certain rules to it. When the rules start changing about how the technical implementation guides the domain solutions, you might find that new words are being established, and they are being enforced gradually as things progress slowly. You might have noticed this whenever you're using some kind of public API, and they say, "Hey, we're deprecating X. From now on, please use this." I recall Stripe is very notorious for being a very good domain-driven design API, where it will say this word means this, and we only use this word in this context, right? So a charge is always a charge. A payment is always a payment, and there's a distinct difference on when something is a charge and when a charge has a payment, or when a payment represents charges. There's certain rules of how to use them, and when the rules change of how to use them, usually the old thing, the technical solution of it, is being deprecated. sunset out of the usage patterns of the use cases, and then gradually allowed to leave the domain of being supported, or maybe it becoming part of a version that is no longer accessible without some extra additional effort. Facebook likes to do this a lot when they say, you have to pick your version. Once you start using deprecated features, you have to explicitly pick the version that I'm going to use the old API, and that is going to be my conscious decision, and I will not have access to certain new things. So that they make it harder to access a certain part of the domain as an anti-corruption layer, so that they can move forward. The other thing that is worth noting about domain-driven design is that it is quite a singular concept, like a phenomena of a movement that was very quickly adopted. It got really popular very quickly, and it's the result of a book. There were derivative books afterwards written. The reason for the anniversary stream today is because the original book, the Blue Book by Eric Evans, that came out about 20 years ago. There were derivative books, and now the stream, you could say, is a derivative media of that. I lost my book somewhere, the original. I think I left it in one of the workplaces that I used to work at. But there are new books as well, especially those from Von Vernon, which is talking about implementing domain-driven design and the various patterns of domain-driven design. And then there's, the classic domain-driven design in PHP, domain-driven design in Java, domain-driven design in Go, and you can find adjacent books to your heart's content. What we're going to look at and explore today is a open source book, which the concept of which, by the way, was new to me. Is the font size okay? Yeah, okay. The Red Book, Raoul Ion. The Red Book is a really good one also. Yes, so Raoul is referring to, I believe, Von Vernon's implementing domain-driven design. I don't know if it's the series or the actual book. It is the actual book. It's not a series. It is this book called Red Book because it has a red cover. But again, I tried to read them. The original book had a very UML heavy emphasis, as it was popular in the 2000s, sort of early 2000s. So I didn't like that aspect that has so much UML concepts and sort of entity relationship diagrams. That was a bit old-fashioned, because test-driven development, the book that I read next, their code examples were again in Java, just like some of them are in Java, C# in the Blue Book. Von Vernon's is also extremely Java heavy. So if back in the day I wasn't a Java developer, that did put me off somewhat from reading the book, but I read them anyway because I really liked the patterns. But then reading the book, I was a bit confused because I thought, okay, well, if I read the book and I'm working in TypeScript and PHP, it does still apply to me. And back then, JavaScript didn't have classes. PHP was in a pretty meh shape. So you actually had to be coding in Java and using generics and things. That was the belief, at least, that the pattern side of domain-driven design was useful. But unfortunately, the important aspect of domain-driven design is at the end. So at the end of the Blue Book. It does get a bit boring to get through the middle sections. I do have to admit that even I struggled a bit with it, especially the first time reading it. So what are we reading today? I found this book by a Finnish gentleman called. I'm sorry. I'm gonna butcher your name. I believe it's Mikael Vesavuri, and the book is about domain-driven design with microservices and Lambda functions in the cloud. So it's it's tackling this idea that microservices are a good application strategy for domain-driven design, which I agree with. It's also one of the conversations I've had with Sander Hugendorn on the Technologies podcast. We also agreed in that episode, which is a 3-hour stream, by the way. If you want to check it out, I wholeheartedly recommend it. He also mentioned that, microservices, that you don't need to do microservices to do domain-driven design, but microservices are a very good strategy for domain-driven design. Anyway, I butchered that quote. So the book is about this online book aims to explain and demonstrate how one might practically apply domain-driven design to a room booking application using a microservice pattern that we will build on Amazon Web Services. So first, straight out the door, I like books that have practical examples where there's a complex problem. The room booking application is very popular. If you recall, the event modeling example application that we're looking at was also a room booking application, so it's quite a common kata. Domain-driven design is a design approach that has been around for almost 20 years, gaining a mastery of attention with the search of microservices. Yes. Focuses heavily on the logical, semantic, and structural side of software development, heavily leaning on the business end, more than on prescriptive implementation, which is ironic, because if you look at the survey answers, there is a slight skew there about, yes, this is the fun bit, so we'll use it, but the hard part that involves talking to other humans, we'll leave that to the experts. But, okay. What you learn to do. So the project is in TypeScript. It's microservices, DDD, clean architecture, and AWS with Lambda. He also mentions the red book, and this is the blue book. So the reason he's writing this book is that he feels that DDD made him a better professional. Just a guy working in software. So the project itself won't be perfect. There are always things to improve and more advanced patterns to bring in. That's okay. However, I feel confident in that the project should be well and good enough to demonstrate what clarity the primary concepts of DDD, microservices, and running it in AWS. So even if you're on-prem, even if you're not using Lambda functions, even if you're not in the cloud, this is all for you. And if you don't use clean architecture or DDD, this is also for you if you want to have an element of learning experience, either with me now live or by reading the book. Structure, you'll find the introduction section first, and the scenario section, strategic DDD, then the groundwork, then the tactical DDD, again, similar terminology as we used earlier, and then the references and resources. Learning goals, first and foremost, is, of course, to make you understand how to practically produce a concrete, minimal, but useful implementation of AWS-based serverless microservices using domain-driven design and clean architecture, and develop it using TypeScript. New skills, domain-driven design. These are the context maps. So published language, anti-corruption layer, shared kernel, open host service, customer, supplier, conformance, and partnership. These are the types of relationships between contexts, between services, and the way they map to each other. Basic understanding of bounded context and subdomains, implementing tactical DDD, value object entities, aggregates, application and domain services, factories, repositories, and domain events. Developers love factories and repositories. Aggregates not so much, but we'll get to that in about 10 minutes. Ease and improve on DDD with a module structure inspired by clean architecture. I combine them the same way as well. I find it very natural to first distill my domain and then keep it clean by adopting the sort of domain, the dependency order that clean architecture recommends. And then, the event, this is the sort of event-driven side, not so much event sourcing. The infrastructure layer, the application layer, how do I communicate with it? How are things being persisted, etc. So I don't want to go into too much detail. Do we have a little? I'm looking for a visual chart detailing the architecture. Okay, we're not going to do a lightning tour. We know about the book. You can check out the book. I do recommend you check out the blue book first if you haven't checked out anything. I did find it easier to grok, especially now since I am later on in my career. Oh yeah, so there's a GitHub. There's a GitHub that highlights the domain. There we go. There we go. That's it. Sorry for. Wait, no, you can't see it. Open up in a new tab. There we go. Here's the diagram. This is what we're doing. This is the solution diagram. These are the, let's say, various use cases within the domain, and these are domain and infrastructure concerns that define the entire application. And you'll see that there are events there as well. I wish we had an event model for it, but hey, you can't always get things. Can't always get what you want. How to follow along. Data modeling. Okay, the data modeling folder contains various forms of data that roughly represent the final shapes. Okay, I like that. So the data modeling. Okay. Let's start there. So the data modeling folder in the GitHub project has all of the bits and pieces of that you would want in domain-driven design, and I can also see terminology that sort of hints at CQRS, right? So there are queries, which would be probably the read side. There are commands. There are domain events that capture things happening or things changing, important events that you might want to persist. There are integration events. So those are third-party integrations that, following the context map, talk about communication with like third-party or external services, or even just a different subdomain. And then there's rules and variants, and then there's ways of how to write them. Add record is something like this. Update booking display is something like this. There's a rule which says update booking display. I don't know what this means, but I'm assuming that's a config file. Then there's the queries. You can ask for slots in this manner, and you can query based on the date and filter. And then there's the domain events. There's an analytics example. There's a booking canceled, host name, slot ID, metadata. Oh, I like the idea of metadata and to carry out that data that you will want to persist with the event, even though the event itself is very narrow. It's a very good detail. It's a very good practice. And that structure seems to be prevalent through the entire through the entire project. It's a nice example. And of course, by no means do I suggest that domain-driven design is, again, that thing where you say, okay, Dennis, what is the ideal folder structure for domain-driven design? What framework should I use for domain-driven design? Does domain-driven design apply for my team, for my project? Domain-driven design always applies to your project. It has nothing to do with your folder structure. Domain-driven design you will use when you are building software for a business problem that is not a commodity. So if you've ever done the Wardley mapping, I'm sorry for jumping from concept to concept, but this is important in domain-driven design. And the Wardley mapping says that you have 4 areas. Where's the map? Tools. Yeah, right. That there's a map, right? There is the right side of the chart, which is completely commoditized. So there's no value in it's the right side is reinventing the wheel, and then the left side is the real novel, unique business concept. And for the iPhone is far left on this chart. creating a phone device that can call a number that's on the far right. It's a commodity. Everybody has a phone that can ring a number, but not everybody has a phone which is also an iPad and a browser, an internet browser without any cheats and hacks, and no VAP, no mobile only web, but the actual web, the internet, the desktop kind of web, right? So that will be on the left side because it's unique and new and novel and extremely high value. So domain-driven design always applies to a problem where your business is solving something that is not off the shelf, that you can't just buy anywhere. There's a unique reason why your business exists and why it's using software. And sometimes your business is very much industrialized. Even if you're an accounting firm, there might be a reason why your accounting firm is slightly different. Maybe you're focusing on a sub niche, or maybe you're focusing on a very specific demographic, and then your software is combining that combination of, yes, we're doing accounting like always, like everybody else, but we're doing it only for this segment. So our software includes specialized information for the segment. So you might be an accounting firm only handling accounting for B2B SaaS startups in Europe that are handling overseas sort of fragmented business into 50 or hundreds of other countries in the Africas and Latin America. Right? So that's already a niche that is adjacent to the domain of accounting. Okay, where were we? So again, this isn't, I'm not showing you this to give you the false sense that you need to follow this folder structure. I showed you this concept because in order to go through this project, they had to extract what are those important business concepts that we care about. What is a booking? What is a room? If there's two people, if the room has rooms, is that two rooms? No, a room is something that has a key, probably, right? So a room is something that has a number. This can quickly, get out of hand. If you ever worked in the hospitality business in a hotel, you will quickly realize that if you have a hallway and a room, it's very awkward to have a room merged across the hallway because a guest might consider that two separate rooms, right? So there, the intuition of the domain overrules any kind of technicality. If you have two keys, even if it's the same ID, if it's two separate rooms, it's two separate rooms. But the key might work for both of them. That is, for example, a very sort of implementation detail, let's say, of a particular domain. What is this domain about? We are doing room bookings. What is the core domain? The core domain is... Oh, he has a template. Oh, but this isn't that. Okay. Well, I would like to see the bounded context for this project. I see. Okay. So they have conducted a interview. The core term in DDD is something that for us non-native English speakers is kind of a mouthful, the ubiquitous language. Ubiquitous in this context means that it's everywhere around us when we are in the domain, so you can't miss it, right? You'll if you try to ignore it, it'll still be there. Like it's like a jargon. It's like office slang. You can think of it as being the common or natural jargon and words that people use when they work together in that context. As such, it's most likely non-technical in nature. That's the important bit, right? You start with the non-technical bit. You start with the jargon, and then you avoid the problem of what do I name this? Because you try to exhaust the nouns and verbs from the non-technical natural jargon, and then you start prefixing them or suffixing them later with things like or service or abstract. Although I don't always recommend that naming convention in all cases, it is helpful. Words are the core of DDD because they, as philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein once wrote, shape the limits of the world for us. The limits of my language stand for the limits of my world. The limits of my language are the limits of my mind. All I know is what I have words for. I remember this quote from my time of life coaching, where you can't express an emotion if you don't have a word for it, right? So if you only have a word for angry, but not frustrated or maybe rage, for example, or enraged or furious, then you might mistake all of these different nuances just for anger. You will always approach them for the same concept as you have words for. It's the same thing as, let's say, colors. If you don't have a word for a certain uh, nuance of color, then you will call it the closest thing you have a word for. You might call, I don't know, my wall white. But it might be slightly off white, especially depending on what filter is going on and what the light is. But because you assume it to be light because it's lighter than everything else in the room, you might call it white, even if it's not perfectly F F F F F F in its hex code, and it's not uniform, and there is a certain shade going on because my lighting is heavily skewed to one side. Without the words to serve our purposes, our implementation will always suffer from this lack. It is more efficient to discuss and collaborate and build common shared worldview that can later be manifested than haphazardly building and failing with something that does not match the actual needs because too little grounding was done. I hate this. When you start with the code and you don't agree on the vocabulary, you can quickly come up with a system where there's a service of some kind, and then there's a booking of some kind, and there's a booking ID, and the developers use the same words as the business people, but then when you give the business people access to the code and the database, they're like, wait, isn't this that thing? No, this is not that thing. This is that other thing that the thing uses, because once you go to the technical detail, there's a one-to-many relationship with them because of a certain date that expires. So this is the thing you take. This is the implementation side, not the interface. And just having a conversation like that is extremely clumsy. I've been there. You've probably been there. It's worth extracting the words so that, even if it's a conversation like, when you use that word booking, what does that mean? What's a booking? Where does the booking stop? If somebody books a room and then cancels and then rebooks the same room, is that a new booking? If we refund and change their room, are those two bookings or one booking? So those are already natural concepts that are completely non-technical that might be of extreme value to you when you're building the domain. When you're building the domain around the nitty-gritty stuff that goes into the implementation code. Beginning with language has many benefits. One of them is that it's non-technical and something we can discuss without a proxy or intermediary. We can come, you don't have to have the product owner in the room to sort of translate for it. It's like, well, okay, what is a booking? Like, it is a word that we can all agree on, and it does not require us constantly explaining which meaning of the word we're using. We can come to an understanding of words and processes, and we can therefore learn, thereby ultimately binding something that is expressed through those same words and processes. We get to match the logical and semantic constructs with coded incarnations of them. Oh, I like this. This is essentially the core of modeling. We get to match the logical and semantic constructs with coded incarnations of them. Oh, I like this quote. All this work has to be done in a cross-functional group where domain experts are a part. Yeah, so as you guessed it, this isn't about you sitting behind a computer and talking to the compiler. This is about meetings. This is about workshops. This is about event storming, event modeling, conducting interviews, maybe even surveying. Okay. Let's see, documenting. Then there's an example. So now we're coming to the example. Let's go back to our functional requirements and start sniffing out the language. Reserve a single room in a single facility, your office, and your time zone. If you notice, this now gets into the realm of creating stories and in a sort of, Scrum manner or Kanban manner. This is the most natural way of doing essentially business requirements gathering. But don't mistake it for this being agile or this having to do with engineering. This is requirements gathering. The whole point of domain-driven design is that you gather your requirements and then extract the domain understanding necessary to understand the requirements. Because I can tell you, hey, yeah, you need to do this, and you need to do debit this, and then refund that, and then if you're using, if you're building some kind of fintech crypto application, I can give you all the requirements, but you might lack the domain understanding for it to make sense to you. You might lack the nuance that a room is not the same thing as a facility, right? And then if you mistakenly interchange these two words, you might be creating, you might be entering a world of pain because you might mess up certain concepts, or you might make entities relate when they shouldn't. There are already some invariants. Reserve the room in slots of 1 hour. At the start of each hour, I already like that detail. Allow for cancellation. So room reservations can be canceled. This is a cancellation noun. So you also get the verb cancel, and then room reservations. You also have reserve. So we have this sort of noun verb pairing, and you can extract these and checked in, filling the blanks. You prune it, and then of course there we go. We get to the important concepts. The state. These are the events. The verbs that control the state transitions, and all the nouns that we need to communicate what is being handled, when, why, what, in what room, in what facility. We saw that the facility is synonymous in certain areas, so it got cut. This is already a very good example, and you can come to the same outcome with event storming. If you want to do event storming, there are many. You can do a business value canvas and then combine it with a little bit of event storming. If the business is large and you're building, like a quarterly roadmap with an important feature, you can just, narrow it down to just that feature and conduct a event storming workshop. One of the things that I do as a coach and mentor for teams is that teams often don't know what questions to ask. So I will train them how to ask the questions that they never asked their product owner or their business expert. I will sort of do a drill with them for 15 minutes of what types of questions are sensible to ask to drive the conversation forward. And then I'll invite the business owners into the meeting. We create a large Miro board if it's a remote setting, and then empower them to ask these questions that we just practiced, and I just facilitate. Maybe I'm bookkeeping, maybe I'm record keeping, maybe I'm just dragging things around the Miro board, maybe everybody's dragging things around the Miro board, and I'm just listening, shadowing the conversation, sort of drive them around. If we get to a little, if you run down a rabbit hole that is sort of a technical detail that one developer is interested about, but it doesn't really drive the entire conversation forward. And that can be extremely valuable because it can solve gaps in your understanding. It can expose misleading or even conflicting terminology when the same word is being used in different contexts. It might expose something that everybody thought was trivial, but actually there was an underlying complex machinery of data having to be processed and handled and copied and moved over and synchronized. Sometimes even the temporal coupling is complex, where you have all the data, but you have this sort of saga problem of the data is coming in out of sync and not always in the same order, and then maybe one of them is missing, so it might have a timeout, and then the entire box can have a timeout. So maybe just bringing those together, the equivalent of somebody buys something and then we have to ship the inventory if the inventory was underutilized, or maybe we can't ship everything in the order, but 9 out of 10 items can be. So maybe we need to split the order if we figure out that that's a problem, or that it's a solvable solution within a day or within 24 hours. And you might have SLAs on how fast this decision has to be done before an automation takes over. When does the human come in? These are all important concepts that are very natural to have conversations about with your business level experts that are completely non-technical, but it will extremely, extremely drive the implementation details. And if you didn't have this conversation, you will have them with yourself, by yourself, while you're coding. So what domain-driven design does in its essence is unavoidable. It's just the question is, are you doing it at the beginning of the project while everyone is present, or just in time? Just in time being you're developing something and you, the developer, find a corner case and you mistakenly think it's a technical problem, but it's actually a business problem that hasn't been discussed. And maybe it's so far into the project that now you have to stop the entire project and have a meeting about this. Now, that is still the right thing to do, but it's very annoying if these surprises keep popping up. That's why things like event storming exist, to manage the risk of even just starting this project. Basim, is that Basim Baidas? Is that Bashem? Is that a sh in one of those use cases? Enjoying the live event. Thank you very much. Thank you for being here live. Thank you for taking the time. If you have any questions, do let me know. Did you use DDD? Did you vote on the survey? If you were to vote, which answer would you give? Are you using the tactical pattern, strategic, or all of them? Thank you for tuning in live. I did find out why some of your comments don't show up, by the way, on my StreamYard. It has to do with the data privacy settings of your account. See, LinkedIn controls the data of your profile, of your name. So if you haven't agreed for your information to be shared publicly, LinkedIn won't share them with third-party applications like StreamYard. So if you go onto the live event on LinkedIn and comment, if your privacy settings prevent it, it won't reach me in my little studio on StreamYard because of the data protection policy. And that's why I sometimes don't see your comments. So it took me a while to debug that. So I'm very sorry. But I am being very diligent to making sure that I don't miss anything important. Okay, let's move on. Setting boundaries. This is going to be about context mapping. This is more to do with more complex systems, but in the context of microservices, this is very important because what you want usually is, with microservices, what is the thing that is micro? It's the team that is micro. It's not the service that is micro. Microservices are a micro team running, providing a service. So you might have 4 bounded contexts here, and maybe each bounded context can be handled by a single developer, or maybe 2, or maybe it's 3 people in different combinations handling each bounded context. And then each bounded context has an underlying microservice that controls it, but usually there's some overlap. The real complexity happens in the overlap of how they are mapping to each other, how they are subservient to each other. Raul says, he took me back to those refinement grooming meetings, which were about 3 hours long, but then that was time well spent because we were all on the same page, had no doubts, and even found missing details for the PM to work on. Yeah, so I find this concept often in the context of agile. If you were to ever go do a sort of non-certified agile course for being a Scrum Master, just by reading the manifesto, just by reading the Scrum book, just by going through all the high quality books that have nothing to do with the certifications of like things like Dark Agile and Scrumfall and Safe and Scaled Agile. This is also one of the core concepts of what a story is. A story isn't a task that you assign to somebody and tell them, implement this. A story is, hey, let's write a story. Let's have a conversation. Let's write a story, a journey, a user journey, a storybook, a storyboard, a storyboard that gets us into the event modeling space, a entire diagram that handles many journeys, many stories. That's event storming, right? So it's this idea that, we need to gather business requirements one way or another. This is one of the best ways to do it. Let's see, event storming, subdomain or bounded context. Yes, I don't want to bore you with the nitty-gritty details, especially if you're new to domain-driven design. This is week 1 of our sort of domain-driven design themes. I don't want to overwhelm you. I just want to get to the basics. And there was an important concept that I want to skip to right now. Again, this is the context mapping. I would like to stay here for a bit longer. You see, because there's this core subdomain that has reservations and displays, and it handles the directionality of the dependencies. Again, this is clean architecture, right? So it says that analytics is downstream and conforming to the subdomain. So analytics will never dictate how this thing has to be implemented, but this thing always dictates how the analytics is implemented. And then there's a supporting domain. It's like, we have verification codes, and then that might tie into authentication or authorization. There's a published language about how we can use that. That there's a certain shared understanding of what, do we exchange tokens? Do we exchange some kind of keys, IDs, etc., and then serve the overall system. I love that there's a context map. Context maps are usually the least popular thing being done in a... Yes, can I? Thank you. Where are we? Where were we even? Groundwork, deciding on cloud architecture, event storming. Okay. And then I'm assuming the event stormed. Okay, there's a few videos on what event stormings are. You'll notice these are very similar to the colors used in event modeling. They're not the same, but they do have a slight overlap. Event modeling is more about seeing the entire life cycle of the data and the project. So you can use it as a project management tool, whereas event storming is more a puristic view of the language, of the ubiquitous language, of the domain-specific language. And then this is the sort of AWS level detail that I'm sure is very interesting to you, that I don't want to go into too much detail on. Tactical DDD. What I do want to touch on is aggregates. Aggregates, TLDR, the aggregate can be confusing. That was my find as well. It has two common meanings. The correct and orthodox one is that the aggregate is simply an entity that itself owns or links other entities in a logical whole. This entails that aggregates like entities each has their own unique identity. The highest level aggregate is called the aggregate root. There must be no way to access the deeper entities without passing the aggregate root, or whichever other construct is highest. For the secondary, more colloquial meaning, it can mean that the actual data object, so something very primitive, not purely well-designed object-oriented, but just like a DTO that we are operating on. So it's more like an infrastructure concern, not so much a domain concern. I love the parallel here with domain-driven design. I find the aggregate term slightly better than saying things like I will access the X entity through the API. Because yes, usually the aggregate is a transaction boundary, and you can always say that even if your API just deals with entities, you can always call the topmost sort of use case into your API, into the sort of the actual nitty-gritty of the API server. You can call that domain aggregate. Domain aggregate might be capturing a session. Domain aggregate might be capturing something, like a tenant, like a specific ID or organization. In AWS, you might look at an aggregate that captures an entire organization, and then there are VPC, and then you have aggregates linking to other aggregates. And deep down, then you'll have specific, services in AWS. If I was to look at AWS as a domain, AWS itself as the business. Aggregate, yes, is very complex, but I would like to sort of show you a little bit of a cheat sheet that will make things a little bit easier. There is one thing, and there are domain-driven design posts that I already made that will highlight aggregates very well. The thing I'm most annoyed about, and I would love to go into this into a little bit more detail next time. Actually, we can go into a little bit more detail on this next episode. I just want to now highlight something very practical regarding aggregates. Aggregates, I think, are being misunderstood because of our massive overuse of ORMs. Right? Because an ORM, what it usually does is that you have a certain table, and it maps to a certain class. Right? I think this is 90% of ORMs. Right? And then in order for you to have an aggregate that is a meaningful transaction boundary, what you would need to have is now, well, if I have multiple of these, what are the multiple things? Right? Like, what is the unit? And the unit is, well, I need to have another table, right? And then the class needs to have an association, and this table then needs to have a reverse foreign key. And this is the part that I hate about ORMs. Because then they say, oh, okay, and then the main class that I use to get the ID, that's my aggregate. This one has the more natural ID, whatever that is. Right? But I hate this oversimplification, because there's a problem here. We made the entire domain layer, the classes, the entities, a conformist implementation of our database. This is what hexagonal architecture is also trying to solve, but I don't quite agree with the solution they propose. Because you see, this entire problem goes away entirely, in its entirety, if you think about it slightly differently. Imagine you have a large table, And this large table has different columns. Imagine you have a user, and certain parts of the user table are about the personal information of the user. Certain parts of the user table are about the password of the user. Certain parts of the user table are about the I don't know, the last time the user logged in. And there are certain parts of the user which are purely analytical for the business, right? So there's different contexts for what's in a row of this table. And the idea of aggregates that I see underused, the most practical version of an aggregate is when one row in one table maps to several classes. And only one of them has an ID. So if the table has a unique ID, then whatever is most naturally bound to that ID, that is the main aggregate root class. And then the rest of the table are being handled by the other classes, the other data types. So when you pull this entire row from the database, you might not have it fully hydrated or modeled to represent the entire row. Because then what that allows you to do is to not model them rigidly to the database, and then you can decide, you know what, this is that, this is this and that, this is this thing in combination with this ID, and this over here is that. This, by far, I think, is the most practical use of an aggregate. Because, again, this is about a transactional boundary and the invariant. Some of these columns might be nullable. And it's plausible to understand that you're not creating a table that might be sparse, that has nullable columns because you're a bad DBA, but that might be the natural flow of the project. So it's natural that when you have an aggregate root that is this, that has certain not subclasses, but certain references to called instances of other classes that hold the specialized data types, it's completely natural to assume that not all of them have to exist at the beginning, that you have to call a method on the root in order for some of these to start existing. Right? So maybe when you create a user, you don't have a password yet until the user decides how they want to log in. Do they want to have a password? Do they want to use Google OpenID? And then once you connect it, the root might have a connect method, the user might have a connect, and then when you connect it, that other thing gets created, and it's a column in the same row. It's just that it's modeled differently. We can go into a little bit more detail about this next time. I just wanted to get this off my chest. Because when I'm coaching, this is by far the biggest aha moment. This is when people are like, you can do that? Oh, but my ORM doesn't support that. Yes, which is why I always say, if the ORM is not serving you, then stop using the ORM. There are certain ORMs where this is easy to do, but it requires writing more infrastructure code, but your domain will be much cleaner. Anyway, if there's any questions at this point, I will be happy to take them. Otherwise, I'll be signing off, and I'll see you next week onto a little bit more detail on the book we just went through. We might even look into some code examples. And I think we can continue this conversation with discussing this idea of what aggregates are and what repositories are, what are some common patterns that make sense. And hopefully you'll have some more questions. Maybe you'll try DDD if you never have. Or maybe you'll have a business problem that now you're a bit more confident to bring up next week, and we can explore and talk about it. So, thank you for tuning in. That's it from me. This is our 1 hour. Thank you all who are watching live. I really appreciate you coming in, spending some time with me, writing in chat, saying hello, connecting with each other. Very welcome. Making an intention up front on LinkedIn to share that you are joining, that you have questions up front. Some people send me messages that I've answered earlier. They send me questions, but they tell me that they can't attend today, which I then try to then weave into the conversation. So that's all from me today. Thank you very much. Have a good one. This time I will loop the elevator music, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.